figures associated with the history of LSD, there is none more enigmatic, arguably, than Michael Hollingshead, appearing seemingly from nowhere in 1961 to turn Tim Leary on to this amazing new drug, LSD. Hollingshead became extremely influential on Leary's years at Harvard, Millbrook and beyond. He was a Zelig-like character and a key player in London's early LSD scene, and in 1965 was sent to London to form a cultural beachhead for Leary's LSD philosophy via the World Psychedelic Centre in Chelsea. I'd be very surprised if there's anyone here tonight who hasn't heard at least a little bit about that's my opening slide, lots of pictures of Hollingshead on. People who haven't heard much about Leary, the Harvard professor who was the person most responsible for the widespread use of LSD and many of the beliefs about it throughout the world between 1962 and his untimely death. Hollingshead's influence on Leary was immense, and their relationship between their first meeting in the early 60s to Hollingshead's death in 1984 varied from obsessively close to years without communication. But although Hollingshead was influential on Leary, Hollingshead and his role in Leary's rise to celebrity status and in the broader history of psychedelic culture is either minimised, misrepresented, or completely ignored in most books and essays. So in 30 minutes or less, it's impossible to do justice to even a small part of Hollingshead's life. And so today I'm going to focus, albeit briefly, on Hollingshead's return to London in 1965 and his time there until he was imprisoned in May 1966. And that's why the title slide, if you saw it, was called Beachhead London. As you know, Joey Mellon has introduced my talk. I'm extremely privileged for that to happen, because what I'm talking about is the scene in London that Hollingshead was involved in with Joe. So I'm just hoping that my facts are even vaguely right. After Hollingshead had turned Leary onto LSD, Hollingshead quickly became a central figure in Leary's circle of scientific, serious explorers. But Hollingshead was not bound by any scientific ethics, or indeed by any ethics at all. Morals and other such qualities seemed to have eluded him, but yet he seemed to have grasped the fundamental truth about psychedelics, which was later played down by the love and peace generation, which is that they are essentially a consciousness amplifying tool and can be used for almost anything if the will of the user wishes it, and can and has been used for anything from close combat fighting in wars, serious rock climbing in Yosemite, and you name it, people have done it on acid and used it for it. It's a tool. But who was Hollingshead? You can see his autobiography slide up there, and I'll hopefully reveal who and what he was all about in my biography, which is being published sometime next year. But was he a fool, an acid guru, a trickster, a black magician, psychologically and emotionally disturbed, a junkie and an alcoholic, a charlatan, a secret agent, a genius, deeply spiritual, a catalyst for social change, the man without whom Timothy Leary would not have happened, the man who turned on the world, or the man who turned on the world in his later life, a selfish sociopath, charismatic, a criminal, and a police informer? Well, in truth, it was all of those and much, much more besides, possibly one of the most complex characters in psychedelia's history. If we were to sum him up very briefly in the terms that a certain Mark Stallman might use, we'd call him a radio man in a television world, trying to attune and retune himself to the age of psychedelics. From a close reading of all available literature, plus documents and letters I've accessed at the Leary archive in New York City Library, it appears that Leary and his close colleagues, such as Metzner and Alpert, couldn't really get the measure of Hollingshead. He was difficult, disruptive on group LSD trips, trying to manipulate or dominate the proceedings. Yet when confronted about this, he just turned on his English charm and they all forgave him. Despite Hollingshead's obvious shortcomings, Leary initially fully supported him, and everyone had a sneaking respect for him and the path he had now set them on. The relationship between Leary and Hollingshead ran hot and cold for a number of years. Hollingshead travelled to and from Britain several times between 61, 65, bringing in and distributing large amounts of LSD, making plans with Alex Trockey to found the Sigma organisation, and making connections with Britain's growing band of psychedelic movers and shakers, including old Etonian Desmond O'Brien, a Lloyd's of London underwriter who was to help Hollingshead in 65. Hollingshead eventually went to live with Millbrook, and as we all know, all manner of psychedelic experimentation went on at Millbrook, with Hollingshead working hard on ways of understanding, enhancing it, and expressing the psychedelic experience. Psychedelics were used in religious contexts, spiritual techniques such as yoga, the I Ching, and basically people often tried to see how high and for how long they could stay in a stratospheric state, and so on. And besides Leary, most of the psychedelic luminaries of the day either visited or stayed at Millbrook. And there you've got Metzner and Alpert being the mainstays. One description of Hollingshead around this time is that he's tall, 30-ish, baldish, with cold, cruel grey eyes. And he said, I am your guide for the weekend, will you follow me? He has an English accent and a soft voice of sinister authority. It makes him sound like Peter Cushing. That was one America's newspaper's description of him. It was great to have around at Millbrook. You know, when the going got rough in LSD trips, he was hardcore. He might have been a difficult and complex personality, but when high on psychedelics, by all accounts, he was a natural, an athlete, just somebody who could navigate any mind space. He could calm people down. He could be a benevolent presence. He could exude a sense of safety, just the sort of person you want to trip with. But equally, the polar opposite was true, and he could be, as Amanda Needpath once described him, a black magician. Leary's writings about psychedelics and his philosophy as to how they should be used rapidly developed between 61 and 65 and were slowly becoming known amongst Britain's early psychedelic community. But while Leary was having a huge impact on the American scene, the Britons were more cynical. The Leary way just didn't seem to be the British way. London DJ and psychedelic adventurer said, no, he didn't say that. He said that. He said Leary, he found Leary too hard going, too falsified in some ways, whereas with Huxley there was a certain clarity to it. Leary was effective at being a self-promoting figure and had a huge impact on the public's perception of LSD. And Hollingshead might have known how to manipulate individuals, but Leary was equally adept at manipulating the media. His perma-grinning visage and portentous announcements about a new religion based on LSD use, or how a woman could have thousands of orgasms during an LSD session, were guaranteed headline grabbers, but were not perhaps the best, or even the most truthful advertisements for LSD. By 1964, Leary wanted a psychedelic foothold in London, and a top-level meeting took place at Millbrook to discuss how the lessons learned there could be spread to Europe, and it was agreed that Hollingshead should again return to London. But this time he was to be financed and supported to establish a psychedelic beachhead, a sort of a mini Millbrook in London, from which he could spread the gospel according to Leary. He was to take with him to London Leary's versions of the great Eastern spiritual classics, the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Tao Te Ching, as well as copies of the new magazine devoted to mind expansion, the Psychedelic Review. October 1965 was chosen as the time for Hollingshead to take Leary's brand of psychedelic religion to the UK. But although Leary appeared publicly enthusiastic about Hollingshead's planned psychedelic beachhead, privately, Leary was expressing serious doubts about Hollingshead's motivations and capabilities. Hollingshead had ripped Leary off on a few occasions for sums of several £1,000s, no small amount in the early 60s, and though he was crucial to Leary's entry into the world of LSD use and research, and although Leary and Hollingshead had a love-hate relationship that lasted until Hollingshead's death, Hollingshead could be and was something of a thorn in Leary's side. The plan to send him to London as Leary's advance guard may have been a last-ditch solution to get him out of Millbrook and Leary's immediate circle. And Barry Miles, the sort of British biography of the 1960s, who's quite frankly good but not always right, and his books are sometimes full of errors, recalls Leary telling him, ignore that, when Dick Alpert and I stood on the dock in New York waving goodbye, I said to Dick, well, that writes off the psychedelic revolution in England for at least 10 years. Now, that's hardly the sort of thing Leary would say if Hollingshead was really capable of acting as his apostle for the planned European psychedelic revolution. Perhaps Leary just saw the whole process as either something that would work, or at least it would get him Hollingshead out of his hair for a while. Whatever Leary was up to, Hollingshead took him at face value and vowed to make his assault on the London acid scene a success and to pave the way for Leary's triumphant arrival in January 1966, believing that then Leary would hire out the Royal Albert Hall for a huge psychedelic jamboree involving the Beatles or the Stones, psychedelic artists and poets and so on. At the end of the evening, Hollingshead would then introduce Leary as the High Priest of Psychedelia. Hollingshead arrived in London in Britain on the 5th of October 1965. picked up at Southampton by oldie Tony and Desmond O'Brien, and after a few weeks staying at the Berkeley Hotel and O'Brien's flat, they took out a lease on flat 225 Pont Street in London's ever-fashionable Chelsea district. This became the rather pretentiously named World Psychedelic Centre, funded by O'Brien. 300 copies of the Psychedelic Experience, 200 issues of the Psychedelic View, and 200 copies of the Psychedelic Reader were delivered to Pont Street from Millbrook, and as Hollingshead put it, oh, he didn't put that, the psychedelic movement in England was small and badly informed. Now, you're getting to see the picture here. Basically, it seems from my reading of things that Leary had decided that he wanted his brand of how to trip, basically, to come to Britain and people to lap it up. And by saying the psychedelic movement in England was small and badly informed, I think it is rather arrogant. He also said that the spiritual content of the psychedelic experience was being overlooked in Britain by people taking LSD at that time. And obviously they needed Leary's way of doing things to make it all right for them. And it also meant that we had a manual for running guided LSD sessions. Now those 3 quotes are interesting because over the past 44 years since I first took acid, I've spoken to many people who took acid prior to 1966, and not one of them has bemoaned the lack of being told how they should conduct or experience an LSD session. Hundreds of people, possibly thousands, were tripping regularly in Britain before 1966, and many had amazing trips based around nature and whatever particular spirituality they may have been involved in, and equally many were just having, and this is something we often miss when it comes to psychedelics, people were having just amazing cosmic fun without the need for method, guru or teacher, and certainly not one from America. Sorry for any Americans present. My viewpoint. Desmond O'Brien's financial backing came from money he'd made as a Lloyd's underwriter, and with this money Hollingshead quickly set about turning Pont Street into a psychedelic ashram with posters, light shows, appropriate spiritual reading material and art books and so on. Acid was sold from there in large quantities and frequently given away, and many people visited there to be turned on by Hollingshead, although not, as he states in his autobiography, any of the Beatles or Donovan. If you've read The Man Who Turns on the World, there's a huge list of who he says he turned on at Pont Street. From speaking to various people, I would say maybe only half, if that is actually true. He did like to big himself up, did Hollingshead. Around that time then, the London LSD scene consisted of several, I suppose, major locations to which psychedelic pioneers gravitated. Trocky's flat, the house at 101 Cromwell Road, antique dealer Chris Gibbs' luxurious Cheney Walk residence, and now Pont Street. Each of these scenes having their own philosophy and view on how LSD should be used. Now, most experienced LSD users of the time advocated doing whatever you wanted whilst tripping, as long as you were safe, having as much fun as possible, and let the insights arise spontaneously. But as we know, Hollingshead held Leary's view that there should be structure to the experience, which should have a guide skilled in the use and meaning of Eastern sacred texts, coupled with light shows and readings to guide one through the various stages. I mean, I managed perfectly well without all that, but, you know, this was what people were told at the time. But despite that, Hollingshead started to change his mind somewhat after meeting Joey Mellon, who had discovered that bad trips were caused by a deficit of sugar in the system of the LSD user, and if sugar lumps or confectionery were eaten throughout the trip, bad experiences would be minimised, and thus it was perhaps not necessary to run a trip as though it was a series of clearly defined processes to go through, religious or spiritual in nature. Sugar lack was the term given to the problems Joey believed that LSD users were encountering, and he worked hard at spreading his particular version of the LSD gospel. Sweets and sugar were always available at LSD sessions run by Mellon, and he enshrined the principles of sugar lack on a wall scroll which he gave out freely to those experimenting with LSD. I've never seen one of those. I'd give my left little finger to possess one. Hollingshead visited Mellon's Cadogan Lane flat and was very impressed with the happy scene he found there. And this is a quote from Joey. Hollingshead was very impressed by the happy scene he found there. Lots of young people on acid eating sugar with no one putting over a big mystery scene. The emphasis seemed to be on unrestrained fun, nothing was planned, and according to Mellon, it was just one long happening. Mellon's approach to taking LSD appeared to be very different from Hollingshead, which is very much focused on the symbols and texts of Eastern religious systems, such as Buddhism, Hinduism, mandalas, mantras, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. They were all staple fare at the World Psychedelic Centre. And although Mellon was serious about LSD as a tool for personal transformation, Hollingshead's approach to LSD sessions disquieted disquieted him, being always in a darkened room smelling of incense with a commentary by the guru. That was the way the Americans had devised to keep people on sugar lax in control. We'll get to that in a minute. Whatever the differences between the two, LSD became a levelling factor and an alliance was formed, with Hollingshead supplying Mellon with as much LSD as he required. When the owner of the Cadogan Lane flat became aware of what was taking place there, they were all thrown out, and Mellon immediately moved into Hollingshead's Pond Street flat and observed the parade of hip, young and old things that passed through the World Psychedelic Centre, either observers and participants. Everyone who was anyone in swinging London wanted to be part of the growing psychedelic revolution. During this time, Hollingshead kept a ferocious correspondence with Leary. He was a massive letter writer. He used to write 3 or 4 letters a day. These are just examples of what he sent to Leary from London, and there are ramblings about the scene there, about what an impact Hollingshead has had, how he can change things, that there's lots of potential there, and so on and so forth. They make very interesting reading. Some of them are clearly written on acid, others not. And in an attempt to establish himself on what might be somewhat cynically be termed the psychedelic guru scene, Hollingshead began publishing documents such as this one, in which he pontificated about LSD in London. This is a London newsletter, Michael Hollingshead, December 1965. So, imagine what people were thinking of this guy who we've sort of all heard of coming over here, and he's handing out these things about what the scene should be like, what it is like, where we should go. A lot of people I've spoken to weren't entirely happy, but Hollingshead had a bit of an ego complex. I think he wanted to impose his ego. In a way, I think he was a bit of a wannabe Timothy Leary, and many people I've spoken to him and knew him well agree with that. It was also a bit of a schmoozer, and around Christmas time 65 he was producing handmade Christmas cards like this, which is a fantastic handmade collage of badges, newspaper cuttings and so on, and I'm lucky enough to own the original of that, which is just a beautiful piece of work. As 1966 dawned over Pont Street, Hollingshead was as high as ever, confident he could have a major effect on the UK psychedelic scene. But word now had reached the authorities that even though acid was legal, a number of psychedelic evangelists were plying their trade in London, and more people were turning to LSD as their drug of choice. Big fun was clearly being had, minds were being blown, and new ways of thinking and living were coming into being. Behind the scenes, the authorities took a dim view of the untouchable goings-on in flats around London. So, January 1966 found Hollingshead's planned hopes for a psychedelic revolution in Britain beginning to unravel. The original plan of him establishing the beachhead, followed by Leary joining him for a rally at the Albert Hall, was in tatters, because in January 66 Leary was on bail for possession of marijuana, couldn't leave America, and his impending trial in February cast a long shadow over Hollingshead plans. The 24/7 activities at Pont Street were drawing attention from the police, and undercover parties were also attending. Undercover police were attending some of the parties there and just partaking in whatever was going on. I don't know, but I was told by Hoppy Hopkins that those 2 slides were taken in the World Psychedelic Centre in Chelsea. I mean, I have no idea if they are, but that was typical of the scene at that time. Even worse, on January 25th, 1966, Hollingshead was arrested for the first time. It mentions it on that charge sheet there. Not surprisingly for LSD, because that was still legal, but for cannabis and morphine, and he was bailed until March 8th. Despite this early warning that the force of law and order were circling, the parties and LSD initiations at the World Psychedelic Centre and elsewhere continued. But Hollingshead now was using more and more methadone and more heroin to balance out the vast quantities of pure LSD he was taking. It was very common for acid users to use methadone at that time, because that gave a bit of forward propulsion to what could be otherwise an overwhelming experience. And quite frankly, Hollingshead just appeared to like heroin, and he was taking acid by night and coming down using the other heroin by day. You might say, well, what could possibly go wrong? Well, it seems that during the winter of 1965, the police had formed some form of dubious, unholy allowance with the scandal sheets, the Sunday newspapers, the News of the World, with the Sunday People, and other gutter journalists, desperate to dig up some dirt on this new drug that was giving people so much pleasure, because you can't have people having pleasure. It's just not right. Undercover journalists and police were going to the flat and seeing what was going on. Some of the police were allegedly accidentally dosed. And the powers that be decided it was time to act. On the evening of the 4th of March, Pont Street was raided again, and Hollingshead, along with Joey Mellon and 7 others, were arrested and charged with an array of offences concerning heroin, morphine and cannabis. Once again, the police found no LSD because they had no real idea what they were looking for, and other than it being controlled by the Poisons Act at that time, it was still essentially legal. That's the March 8th bail sheet there. Hollingshead freaked out. The pressure and the drugs finally got to him and he jumped bail, we think, to Norway, his old 1950s stamping ground. The World Psychedelic Centre was unravelling fast. And in mid-March, the quintessentially swinging 60s magazine, London Life, heavily trailed its forthcoming LSD expose. This was on buses, it was in other newspapers, everything. It was really hyped. Television had some ads on about it. You know, LSD, the drug that could threaten London. The editor of London Life had been offered an exclusive interview with Desmond O'Brien, Hollingshed's sidekick. Hollingshead, having jumped bail, could have no say in what was going on and knew nothing about the forthcoming expose. And the expose itself was published on March 19th, and it's worth reading if you can get hold of a copy. I don't know why that's doing that, but it is. It was headed "The Drug That Could Become a Social Peril," and the article opened with Desmond O'Brien rather unwisely, introducing himself as Mr. LSD and nonsensically claiming that anyone could take control of London simply just by putting LSD in the water system, which, as we know, is a complete myth. It can't be done. You'd have to have more LSD than ever existed, and it probably still wouldn't work. The News of the World and the Sunday People also ran exposés of London's LSD scene and told torrid tales of what their undercover reporters had witnessed at Pont Street and elsewhere. The tide was rapidly turning on LSD's fortunes, and within a few months, by the autumn of 1966, LSD would be made illegal in Britain without any serious tests being done to demonstrate why it should be legislated against. It just went through on the nod. Hollingshead was on the run and was finally arrested in Norway, and after missing 2 court appearances, Interpol was alerted and he was brought back by 2 police officers who were sent out there to fly him home in handcuffs. On the plane back to London, according to stories told by Hollingshead later, and I've had this from 3 separate people who have never met each other, so I believe there may be some truth in it, especially knowing Hollingshed's character. Whilst on the plane, he managed to dose the police officers with acid, get out of the handcuffs and continue his freedom in London for a few days before handing himself in. Whether that's true or just further examples of Hollingshed's self-aggrandizement, we'll probably never know, but I like to think it's true. Hollingshead was sentenced on 24th of May. Although he could have had legal aid or paid for legal representation, Hollingshed's ego and megalomania got the better of him and he decided to conduct his own defence. He compounded this folly by arriving at court high on acid, which, as he notes in a classic piece of understatement, quote, enhanced the unreality of the scene. Well, duh. He was sentenced to 21 months in custody. So that was it, the dream was over. Hollingshead and Leary's aspirations for their version of a psychedelic Britain were over, and although Leary would visit occasionally, there was never any huge rally with the Beatles or the Stones. And although Hollingshead went on to have many adventures within psychedelic culture in Britain, America and Nepal, all of which will be revealed in my forthcoming book, he never quite achieved what he set out to do. His drug habits and his complex personality constantly seemed to undermine his best efforts. And I'm going to give the last word today about Hollingshead, which again comes from Joey Mellon, who said he was sex mad and he didn't get enough because he was off-putting to girls, sort of driven and mad. I think he used his drugs to get sex. He did have an evil side, I'm afraid. In a way, it was as though he couldn't help himself. I don't really think he was evil like some people are. He wanted to get what he wanted and he would use his drugs to get it. I think he really didn't understand love, and I think that last few words, again, from people I've spoken to across Hollingshead's life, right up to his death, really sums him up. He was a tormented individual who found himself in an arena where he thought he could be something. He could be Tim Leary, but he couldn't, and it all went downhill. Whether he was a secret agent working for various intelligence agencies has been suggested. I don't know. There's certainly some evidence that he was informing on John Beresford when he lived with him in New York in the early 60s. John Beresford knew about this apparently and let it continue because he was such a nice man and didn't want conflict, and so on and so forth. Is it 11? In that case, I've come to the end. It's break time now, so if anyone wants to ask me any questions as I pack up, that's fine. I'm around all weekend if anyone wants to speak to me, and thank you very much.